Space Cowboy Books presents Simultaneous Times, a science and speculative fiction podcast. Short stories to stir the imagination by contemporary authors.
Confessions of a Supermassive Black Hole by Holly Lynn Walrath, with music by Luke Poole. Confessions of a Supermassive Black Hole. You can't escape my body. I deform space-time, invisible, collapsing even as everything surrounds me. I am the center of you, of your galaxy. Sieving particles, radiation, light through my skin. I search for the ghost of my former self. My gravity is also my weakness. Effigy by Jean-Paul L. Garnier, with music by Red, Blue, Black, Silver and Dane Luscombe, recorded live at Joshua Tree Art and Music. Effigy. The screech of breaking metal and wood was unbearable even through the hull of the ship. After 25 months in the silence of space, the racket was deafening. But Edgar had no time to think about that. His ship was coming apart around him. The view screen showed nothing but green and brown slapping past the nose of the craft, obscuring all view, but doing little to slow down his entry speed. The shielding ripped away like wet paper. Sweat dripped from his face, as much from nerves as from the overheating cabin. Gauges spanned too fast for him to get any accurate readings, and without knowing up from down, his chances at righting the craft were nil. Edgar decided to chance it, and yanked the lever in an attempt to send the ship upward and hopefully lose some momentum. He chose wrong. Edgar awoke and assumed that the dampness around him was blood. He could see nothing through the eternal blackness. Crawling on all fours, looking with his hands, he discovered that the wet ground extended far beyond where he had regained consciousness. He ran his hands over his body, looking for injury, and surprisingly, found that he was intact. Nothing broken, no flesh torn. But this did nothing to stop the pain, the throb in his head, or the dry harshness of his throat. He fumbled through the darkness until he came into contact with the ravaged nose cone of his ship. Its injuries far outnumbered his, but it was something familiar in the blackness. Searching with his arms outstretched, he realized that this section of the ship was the only remnant in the vicinity. He dragged himself inside the torn opening of the cone and curled in a ball, waiting for sleep, while noises from unknown life yanked him back to cold, black reality repeatedly.
Suns rose one after another until the jungle lit up with every shade of green, yellow, and a few colors which Edgar could not recognize. There was only visibility in the direction in which his craft had parted and snapped the trees. He struggled to his feet and surveyed what was left of the ship. The areas of the craft that contained his supplies were nowhere to be seen, probably somewhere far off towards his entry point.
I must have hit it too steep an angle. The atmosphere seems thick. This isn't what the readings from Starbase predicted. They won't even know I'm in trouble unless I can locate the radio. And my supplies could be hundreds of miles off for all I know.
Edgar shook these thoughts from his mind and inventoried what was left inside the nose cone. As he entered, a cry from the distance sounded. He froze, trying to identify it, but nothing in his mind matched the beastly terror that had billowed out of the jungle. He told himself that he had imagined it and went back to his work. The cone contained next to nothing. His heart sank. All that was left was a plasma cutter, wall-mounted, and virtually useless to him. It was stored there for ship repairs and parts fabrication, but there would be no repairs. There wasn't even a ship left. Edgar fell to his knees in despair. A plasma cutter and a nose cone were hardly what he needed if he were going to survive. Another shriek emerged from the jungle and kicked his survival instincts into overdrive. He needed a weapon, or at least something to fend off whatever demon lurked out there in the trees. Then it struck him like a meteor. He reached for the plasma cutter and furiously began hacking at the remains of the ship until he had removed the basic shape of a scimitar. He beat it flat with 2 rocks, then wrapped the crude handle with a vine pulled from a nearby tree. He held the simple sword in his hands and raised it to the sky. Pointing it to the 3 suns, he yelled,
I will survive!
His cry vanished into the trees and a moment later was echoed by another, more ominous. His brief hope shrank.
I must move. Find a way out of this tree cover. See where I am.
He scanned the surrounding landscape, then took off running in the direction of the felled trees, hoping to find something of his ship and supplies, hoping to find anything that might help him survive this unknown wilderness. He ran for hours, driving himself towards exhaustion. Mile after mile, the jungle remained the same. Downed trees, twisted vines, and the horrible howling that seemed to surround him. Nearing the point of collapse, he tried to push on, then heard a new sound penetrate through the trees. Water. The soft gurgling diverted his attention as he cautiously left the path that his ship had carved. Moving slowly, he came upon a clearing. A gentle brook sparkled and flowed before him. Edgar fell to the water and gorged himself, forgetting all foreign dangers and lingering in the sweet relief of something cool to drink. As he lay sating his thirst, a crash rang out through the clearing. He rolled over, sword in hand. Before he could see the creature, it was upon him, dead from a bleeding hole pierced through its belly. The beast was heavy, and it took all of his strength to roll the carcass off of him.
I was lucky this time. I better watch my back.
The animal was huge, armored like a rhino, but clearly with the agility of a cat. Edgar stared at its 6 legs and marveled at what speed such an animal could run. Had his sword not struck its stomach, it would be him that was lying there dead. Yet hunger led him away from these thoughts as he set about the ugly work of ripping into the thing's flesh and building a fire to cook the foul-smelling meat. It made him wretch, but if he were to survive, he must eat. Edgar had no way of knowing how long the days lasted. The disorientation of the 3 suns and the jungle-filled horizon left him no way of understanding the length of the days. But the length of the night stretched out before him in an endless nightmare filled with the sounds of strange beasts and foreign winds. Having no agenda other than to survive, he followed the path carved by his crash, hoping all along that the stream that had sustained him roughly followed the same land. He was able to sustain himself by snaring smaller prey during the brief time he spent sleeping, and the random fruit found hanging from branches, unpalatable but edible. Day after day, this scenario repeated itself until he had counted 24 successive nights where all 3 stars dipped below the horizon. On the 25th rising of the small suns, he felt weary and was yet to find any remnant of his craft. The scimitar felt heavy in his hands, the tightness of his calves matched only by that of his thighs. Still, he ran on. Somewhere in between the noons, he saw a glint in the distance. This first change in scenery spurred him on with newfound vigor. He found new speed, yet paced himself knowing that this change could be a lifesaver. When he arrived at the obstruction in the landscape, he found that it was just a shed piece of the hull. Nothing else was present. But the area had been cleared of branches, and a great circle of stones had been erected around the debris. Not far off in the distance, Edgar could see another piece of the craft shining, thoroughly unwelcome and foreign to the rest of the terrain.
It must be a larger section of the craft. Perhaps now my hopes are warranted.
When he reached this section of the ship, he found that it too had been cleared of debris. Again, a large circle of stones, this one even grander. He froze in position. This sight added to his hope, the feeling of being surveilled. Hands had done this work, and it gave him the sense of foreboding that accompanied all men under attack. But the attack didn't come. He surveyed the jungle in all directions and saw no movement. Assured that he was alone, he entered the torn section of the ship. It was a hollow shell. If anything had remained, it had been removed by the makers of the stone circles. Disheartened, but grateful for a familiar shelter, he lit a small fire and curled up to sleep, keeping the scimitar in hand as he drowsed off into dreams of shrieking jungles. Edgar awoke to a sizzling sound. The fire had been doused and steam rose from the extinct flames. Before moving, he surveyed the scene. There was no mistaking that someone or something had thrown water on his fire. Intense cold surrounded him. He saw nothing in the darkness. Then a face appeared to him through the pitch black. Before the face, a crystal on the end of his staff glowed a faint purple. Hand extended, pointing at the remains of the fire. Unintelligible words were spoken, but it sounded as if they were addressed to someone other than him. The staff reached towards the fire pit and reignited the fire as if by some kind of magic. In the light, Edgar could see that he was surrounded by 3 women wearing loose gowns, all of the same color. Again, the hand pointed to the fire, and this time, in the light, he could see that the head was shaking back and forth with the universal gesture for no. Then the flames were doused again and all was black. Silence spilled over the scene as he was irresistibly pulled into a deep sleep. As he came to again, he felt around for his scimitar. It was missing. So were the women who had stood over him the night before. Now it was day, and 2 of the suns were already high in the sky. All traces of his fire had been removed, even the ashes. He stood and surveyed the scene. The stone circle around the debris was immaculately constructed, as if the builders had started working the moment the craft had crashed, and not ceased their toiling until a level of perfection had been attained.
Why would they put so much care into building this? And they didn't harm me in any way, just put my fire out. What could their motivation possibly be?
The women left no trace that they had even visited the scene, save for the circle. And they had left him alone. Again, he searched for the scimitar. Nothing except the hollowed piece of hull remained in the vicinity. Without much hope, he continued in the direction he had been headed. If he were lucky, they hadn't gutted every section of the craft. Unarmed and frightful, he sulked through the felled trees. There was no longer any need to run. He knew he was being watched. He could sense them everywhere in the jungle. The howls from the jungle continued endlessly. When they rose to a fever pitch, he broke a branch from a nearby tree and stripped it of its leaves to form a crude club. Without the sword, he was vulnerable prey.
I doubt those women would help me if I were attacked again.
A rustling in the closest bushes piqued Edgar's senses, and without thinking, he ran towards the sound, beating the shrubs and vines with his club, making as much noise as possible. The jungle fell silent, except for a few cries from far-off birds. He yelled as loud as he could, attempting to exert his dominance over the landscape. Then a deep silence grew from the trees, followed by an echoing of his shouts. Screams came from everywhere around him, growing into a chorus of fear. But it was his fear that grew. The cries from the jungle sounded as if they were a mockery. Or was it veneration? Terror struck inside Edgar's heart, which pounded like a hammer on an anvil. His sauntering was over, and again he broke into a rapid stride, trying to cover as much ground as he could, trying to distance himself from the horrible shrieking. How long he ran he could not say, but one of the suns was setting when he found he could run no longer. He kneeled, panting, gasping in the heavy air. When he caught his breath, he looked up at the path. In the dying light of the last two suns, he saw a glint that looked as if it were coming from metal. As he approached the glare, he crossed another large circle of stones. Within this great circle was another formation made of rocks. From several yards away, he could see that the stones were laid out in the shape of a giant scimitar. Within this imitation of his sword, precisely in the center, he saw his weapon sticking out of the ground. It was the source of the glare that had drawn his curiosity. Again, he broke into a run, defying his aching muscles. Reaching the sword, he drew it from the ground with some difficulty. The metal was warm, as if someone had been holding it for a long time. Sword in hand, he sensed the hairs on his neck begin to rise as a wave of anxiety overtook him. Someone was nearby. He could feel their eyes on him. How many he could not say, but he knew he was probably surrounded. He fled from the clearing and plunged into the tree cover with wild abandon. From now on, he would not loosen his grip on the scimitar, his only tool, his only chance of survival. He could hear branches snapping all around him. Someone, many people, were crashing through the trees behind him. Fatigue was burning in his limbs, but he could not risk capture, if that is what his pursuers had in mind. For all he knew, it was much worse than that. Perhaps they were hunting their next meal. But they had left him sleeping before. Why had they not taken him then, if that was what they wanted? So far, he had seen no trace of anything man-made, save for the debris from his ship. Where were they coming from? Edgar ran on and on, slashing vines out of his way with the homemade sword. He could not tell how long he ran, but when he finally stopped to catch his breath, the jungle was silent. No sounds of animals or men. Complete silence. The jungle was now shrouded in darkness, and he had no way of telling which direction he had come from. But he had to make his way back to the channel carved by his craft. The ship and its precious supplies were his only hope. In this total darkness, he would not be finding his way. He would have to wait until the suns rose again to get his bearings. Incredible thirst made itself known, and he wished that he had consciously followed the creek instead of bolting off aimlessly. Slowly, he groped his way through the trees, hoping to catch the scent of water. Judging by the broken branches in his wake, he picked the direction that he thought led back to the clearing, proceeding with caution. With any luck, he could make his way back to the stream undetected. Every few steps, he stopped to listen to the jungle. Silence. He wished he still had the energy to run. But even if he did, it could be futile with no way of knowing which direction he was headed in. Fatigue began to overwhelm him once again. Finding a sheltered nook beneath a giant tree, he curled up to try and get some rest. Fearing that his sword might be stolen again, he ripped a vine from the nearby branches and tied the weapon to his hand. He tugged on the sword several times, making sure that it was secure, then drifted off toward dreams of better times. With suns in the sky once again, he crept his way through the jungle until he found the path of felled trees. He understood which direction to take, for the trees had all fallen in the same way, pointing away from his destination. The jungle remained eerily silent. He hadn't heard anything but his own footsteps since his escape.
I better stay out of the clearing now. I'll walk inside the tree line, a few feet from the path, so I'm harder to see. If only I had my fatigues.
He moved through the trees, unable to run. The shrubs and vines were too thick for a quick pace. Edgar could feel eyes on him from every direction, but saw no one, no animals of any kind. The silence continued. Sensing a presence, but hearing and seeing nothing made him fearful. Walking through most of the day, he saw nothing, no sign of his ship, just endless jungle. But he had to go on. The silence was merciless. It filled him with hopeless loneliness. He tried crying out to see if there would be any response. None. Dread set in. Then panic. Forgetting all about his plan to stay in the tree cover, he dashed out into the clearing. The jungle remained frozen as he broke into a run once again. Dizziness came on in waves as he tried to maintain his gait. He ran until he collapsed. The trees span. His senses faded back slowly. He was looking up at the last of the day's suns. He drank from the stream until semi-clarity returned. He sat rubbing his sore legs, longing for home or the comfort of his spacecraft. He knew none of these things were possible without locating the ship's radio. This knowledge alone kept him from surrendering to an unthinkable fate. Once again, he rose and started for the path. In the dimming light of the last sun, he saw it. A large section of the craft, more intact than the ones he had thus far encountered. His heart surged. Maybe there was hope yet. With what was left of his energy, he began to run again, slowly at first, picking up speed the closer he got to the wreck. As he neared the ship, he saw that it too had a massive circle of stones surrounding it. This circle was different than the others. It was built up into a small wall. Clearly more time and effort had gone into the veneration of this section of the craft. The scene looked religious. He came upon the ship and saw that while it was largely intact, like the other sections, it had been gutted. Then his mouth fell open as he gazed at what lay beyond the wreckage. It didn't seem possible, but it stood there right in front of him. He moved closer in disbelief. After circling the ship, it came into full view. A replica of his spacecraft, an almost perfect rendition, life-size and unreal in the fading light. It was nearly identical, both in proportion and in detail. How the creators of the sculpture knew what the craft looked like before it broke apart was impossible to ascertain. Yet there it was, made of branches and vines. Edgar could see through the window that there was even an effigy of him piloting the ship. Fear gripped his heart. He looked around but still saw nothing, heard nothing. He moved around the reconstruction slowly, taking it in from all angles. It was huge and must have taken many people with great skill days to construct.
Why would they do this? And the sword outline made from stones. Do they think I'm a god or...
Before he could finish the thought, he came to the rear side of the sculpture. A large rectangle of boulders had been erected near the cargo doors of the facsimile. Within the rectangle was the body of the beast he had slain and eaten. What was left of the body had been laid out in a sanctimonious manner. He had killed the beast many days earlier, but no sign of putrefaction showed on the animal's carcass. Considering how long it had been dead, it was in pristine condition. And something else was wrong. There was no smell. The air should have been rank with decay, but there was no smell at all. Only then did he realize he had smelled nothing for days. The jungle was devoid of almost all sensory stimuli. The silence broke. All around him, the sounds of the jungle returned. Cries, shrieks from birds, leaves rustling, water gurgling. It was as if a mute switch had been turned off. With the sound came the smells: moist soil, vegetation, water, life. But still the body of the beast gave off no scent. It appeared serene, as if it were merely sleeping. Its face had a placid demeanor, as if it was unaware of being dead, as if it had not died in combat. Something about the creature didn't seem right, other than its lack of smell.
Why would such a foul beast be treated with such reverence? It's as if it meant something special to these people, whoever they are.
As if this thought was a cue, women approached from all angles, closing in around him in a massive circle. They all wore identical robes and advanced with deliberate movements. An almost imperceptible hum came from the women. Its low tone was soothing but held ominous overtones. Edgar looked back at the creature lying within the stones. It looked even more alive now. It looked as though it awaited the approach of the women, as if they were intrinsically connected somehow. He thought he saw the creature stir.
But it's been dead for days. I ate him. He cannot be alive.
He knew that the beast could not be living. Its flesh had sustained him. He had butchered it himself. Yet as the robed women approached, his fear of the beast was ignited. He almost expected the creature to lunge at him once more. The hum from the women grew louder as they neared him, closing the circle. It was starting to sound like chanting. He could not make out any discernible words, but they flowed from the women as though from a single mouth, perfectly in unison. Every other woman in the advancing line stopped as if it were previously choreographed. Those who did not stop continued closer towards him. He gripped the scimitar with all his might.
If they wanted to take me out, they already would have. Am I really considering doing battle with women?
He felt foolish brandishing the sword as if he were a warrior. He didn't want to put up a fight, but his survival instincts had kicked in full gear and adrenaline pumped through his being. The second circle stopped about 15 feet from where he stood. Their chanting continued. One woman continued to advance. He recognized her from the staff she held. It was the same woman that had warned him about his fire. The look on her face, which was illuminated by the glowing crystal on her staff, shone grave and serious. She alone did not chant, but the volume of the others increased as she neared his position. Her eyes seemed to stare into his soul. They were free from expression, but their intensity made him nervous. When she was but feet from him, she uttered a few unrecognizable words. He could not be sure if they were directed towards him or to the women in the circles. She raised the staff in the air as if to strike. He held his stance, not wanting to provoke a fight. Again she spoke the same words, then pointed the glowing crystal in his direction. The crystal looked as though it contained lightning. After pointing at him, she raised the staff, and this time pointed at the corpse of the felled beast. The crystal glowed even brighter now, its lightning becoming more like the sun. Edgar's heart pounded inside his chest. He was unsure how to proceed, or if he should attempt to communicate.
Maybe I've stumbled into some kind of religious service. Maybe I should just back away slowly.
He took one step backwards, then thought better of it. She had clearly been addressing him with the staff, and it was no coincidence.
Maybe they're thanking me for slaying the beast.
But the look on her face was not one of gratitude. The chanting grew louder still. The lone woman walked up to the beast where it lay amongst the stones. She faced the creature silently for a long time. When she turned back to Edgar, the look on her face was one of anguish and mourning.
Oh no. The animal must have meant something to them.
Again she muttered unintelligible words. The language was guttural and strange, almost beastly. She came towards Edgar. The pained look on her face remained frozen. It was clearly directed at him. He mouthed the words,
I'm sorry.
but their meaning was obviously lost on her. Her gait was slow and deliberate. Her gown blew in the soft breeze, and only then did he realize that he found her quite beautiful. But her grimace turned to scorn when she stopped in front of him. Unsure what to do next, he gripped the scimitar tightly, ready to defend himself, but at the same time unwilling to harm a female. She glanced down at his weapon. His fingers gripped tighter still. She saw a bead of sweat drip from his brow, signaling his fear. Raising the staff above her head again, Edgar saw the crystal flash with energy. She said something in a loud, clear voice, and as she did, his sword was invisibly pried from his hands, levitating in the air in front of him. He tried to snatch it from the air, but it moved away from him faster than humanly possible. He watched the scimitar gliding through the sky. It struck the ground in front of the beast, planting itself into the soil to the hilt. Edgar's breath grew short. She brought the staff down gently and placed it on his forehead. He could feel a surge of energy as his eyes flashed and purple lightning filled his periphery. The light was unbearable and forced him to shut his eyes. When he opened them again, he was kneeling in front of the corpse of the beast, next to the sword. He wanted to reach for the weapon, but his body was paralyzed. But his eyes could still move. He glared around and saw that both circles of women were now approaching. Their chanting never ceased. The lead woman once again positioned herself in front of him, standing between his body and that of the creature. Again, she placed the crystal staff onto his forehead, then moved it away from his face and placed it reverently onto the forehead of the slain animal. Purple lightning poured like liquid from the creature's face. It moved in straight lines towards Edgar, entering his eyes and blinding him with the visions of the creature's life. The animal was the center of the women's lives.
And I ate the damn thing. What have I done?
From his kneeling position, he started to see that the creature was rising from its deathbed. He wanted to cry, but no sound would come. The lightning still connected them. And then it went out abruptly. Edgar could no longer feel his heart pounding against his chest. All was still. He tried to draw a breath but could not. As he thought that it might be time to pray, he opened his eyes for the last time. But it was not his eyes that he saw through. He was looking through the eyes of the beast. He looked upon himself and saw what was once his body slouch, then crumple to the floor. The chanting of the women reached a fervor. He gazed up from his corpse and saw the reproduction of his craft. The woman with the staff approached the facsimile and raised the staff towards it. Again, purple lightning shot from the staff, igniting the twigs and branches. Through the creature's eyes, he saw the mimicry go up in flames, lighting up the night sky. He looked through the window of the craft where the effigy of him had stood. Instead of a man made of sticks, he saw his own form, fear-stained face gasping from the smoke. As his senses faded, he could hear the faint cries of the man that had once been him, dying in the flames.
In this episode of Simultaneous Times, you heard Confessions of a Supermassive Black Hole by Holly Lynn Walrath, with music by Looppool. And Effigy by Jean-Paul L. Garnier, with music by Red, Blue, Black, Silver and Dane Luscombe. Theme music by Dane Luscombe. Out now, Simultaneous Times, Volume 1, Paperback Science Fiction Anthology. Available at spacecowboybooks.com and lulu.com. Be sure to visit us at our store in Joshua Tree, California, or at spacecowboybooks.com. And connect with us on Instagram or Twitter. We'd love to know what you think of the program. And now a word from other fellow Joshua Tree podcasters.
We live in a very weird place. A dry and mountainous land of poisonous creatures and desert monsters, missing tourists, and strange lights in the sky. Join us every Friday at 10 p.m. for a late-night voyage across the mysterious Mojave Wilderness on KCDZ 107.7.
Desert Oracle Radio, the voice of the desert.
Are you looking for a new way to think and transform? Tune into Myth Matters, a bi-weekly podcast of storytelling and conversation about mythology and why it's important to life today. Find a more creative way to live. Learn more at mythicmojo.com and keep the mystery in your life alive.
Have you ever wondered why people live in the desert? I'm Dawn Davis, and I host Desert Lady Diaries podcast. It's a weekly conversation with women who found their home in the Mojave Desert. Each week, I talk to women who were either born and raised in the desert or felt called to come here and what the desert means to them. You can learn more about the podcast and listen at desertladydiaries.com.